Hi, I'm Andrew and this is my PhD project presentation. So my project is entitled Enhanced Yield and Quality of Humic Products from Lignite. So I'll explain what some of those terms mean shortly. The key part is it's based at Federation University in Gippsland, which is where I'm based, and it's also where my supervisors Vince and Alicia are based, and the lab that would be doing the research in. We're partnered with Omnia, who are also based near Moore, and my supervisor there is Teferi, and we're also supported by Australian Carbon Innovation. Just to give you an overview of what I'll be covering in the presentation, I'll talk a bit about the background of the project, so helping to explain what lignite and humic substances are so that the rest of it hopefully makes some sense. I'll look at some of the existing work in the field, so previous studies. Then I'll be looking at what I'm aiming to do, some of the key objectives, and what's unique about that particular research. Some of the data I've collected already I'll be presenting and looking at what the next steps are going to be for the research. A quick timeline and budget, and then I'll wrap things up at the end. This project is a joint partnership between three entities. So at the middle we have Federation University, which is where I'm based, and where we have the laboratory equipment and the academic expertise to facilitate the research. Then we've got Omnia Specialties, who's based out of Moore. They've been operating for 20 years producing humate products. And 2 years ago, they upgraded their facility to roughly quadruple how much they could produce, owing to increased demand internationally. And so now they have a capacity of about 18 megalitres per year. So a couple of the main products they make is the liquid and solid humate, potassium humate products for agriculture. And the key is that so far they've been able to use a particular source of the coal that's highly rich in these substances. But that's not guaranteed as a supply into the future. And so we're looking at whether we can take run-of-mine coal, which is not as good as a raw material, and upgrade it first in the lab and then in production to produce an equivalent or better product cost effectively. The project's also supported by Australian Carbon Innovation through the Australian National Low Emission Council Research and Development Fund, and so that supports low emission carbon technologies. Now the reason this matters is you actually need a certain amount of carbon and carbon-based compounds in the soil for plant growth, or it's not very productive. So some of the key things that it helps with, the humate products and just soil organic carbon, is maintaining general soil structure. So the ability for things like water to penetrate it, so keeping it a more porous structure than being too compacted and allowing plants to grow more easily. It helps with retaining water and fertilizers, so improving fertilizer efficiency and also increasing resistance to droughts. Nutrient availability is a big one. So it's able to help with retaining nutrients so they don't wash away in the ground soil as easily, and makes them more available to the plants. The other big one is supporting soil microbes. So microbes often form a symbiotic relationship with plants, or quite a few can, but they also need a fuel source to kind of help get things going and inoculate those. So that's another role of the carbon in the soil. I'll just explain a bit about what humic substances are. So when you get biomass, which is usually mostly plant material, sometimes some animal matter decaying, you have a mixture of microbial breakdown and some chemical changes that occur. And some of what forms is humic substances. Now they're defined classically, that goes back over a century, based on their solubilities under acid or alkaline conditions. So humic acid is defined as being soluble under alkaline, but not acid conditions. Fulvic acid is soluble under both and in between. And the humin fraction just isn't soluble in water, at least. Now the fulvic acid has the lowest molecular weight, the humic acid is in the middle, and the humin has the larger molecular weights. The other thing that sort of changes across between the different fractions is you get more acidic functional groups in the fulvic acid. You've got a number of them, a reasonable number in the humic acids, as the name would kind of suggest. And you have a lot less in the humin fraction, but you have more aromatic structure, so carbon rings, which is an indication of how condensed the molecules are. Now coal, to bring that into context, is formed when you then have substances that have been humified, which then tend to compress and form into peat. and then they undergo the process of coalification. So from peat, with increased time, burial, and therefore with pressure, you get this progression through the stages of coal. Now what we have is fairly immature lignite, and that's actually quite good for what we're trying to do with it. But as it progresses further through the stages, it removes more water, and it also undergoes chemical changes where the molecules sort of join together more to become bigger. They lose some of the oxygen and maybe a little bit of the hydrogen, so they become more carbon rich overall, which is more suitable for combustion, but less suitable for, say, extracting humic substances. So one of the advantages of our brown coal is it's not actually particularly good for burning. It's got a very high water content. It's still got a fair amount of oxygen in it, and it's got a reasonable amount of humic substances. It's got a lot more in the naturally weathered coal. It's got a bit less in the standard run-of-mine. But if it was to progress further through that coalification process, it's much harder to re-extract those things out of it. So being a younger coal and easy to get to is actually quite advantageous. Now these are just some structures to try and make a bit of sense about what the different substances are. So we've got fulvic acid down the bottom is the smallest structure, and it's got quite a few of those acidic groups, the COOHs, and not too many ring structures. Humic acid has quite a mixture of the two, but by the time you get into the lignite structure, there's a bit less of those acidic functional groups, and then a reasonable number of ring structures, but joined together by shorter chains of carbon backbone. So this helps account for some of the different properties that we get with these different fractions, and obviously the molecular weight increases as you go from fulvic acid through humic acid into the larger lignite structure. Some of the existing work that's been done on oxidizing coals and lignites has used a range of different oxidizing agents. One of them is oxygen, whether that's in the form of O2, regular oxygen, or ozone, which is O3. Some have used nitric acid. Now technically that does make something slightly different to nitrohumic acid, as it introduces nitrogen groups. So a little bit could be advantageous, but technically it's a slightly different substance, and you potentially then have to manage nitrogen-based compounds coming out of it. So certain nitrogen-based gases might evolve, or you could potentially have other wastes you have to deal with in the liquid part. Hypochlorite is a great bleach for the home. It also actually works pretty well as an oxidizing agent here to actually help break down the coal structure. The downside is it introduces chlorine groups, which is not going to be good for our application. Electrooxidation is one that's been done where it essentially uses a galvanic cell, so kind of like electroplating or electrolysis, where you're trying to split, say, water apart. This actually helps to try and split the coal into smaller parts, into the humic acids, and that can work reasonably well, but it's got its limitations as well. One of the ones that's been done quite commonly and is shown to be quite effective is the use of hydrogen peroxide. It's used in hair bleach, and it's quite an effective oxidizing agent. You can get it commercially at large scales. Now for these studies, there's quite a range of locations around the world where the coal was sourced from, so across multiple different continents, which makes them kind of hard to compare because each location has its own unique properties for the coal or lignite. The amounts used vary a lot, so there's 0.1 up to 60 grams, so the range, it's typically below 3 for many of the studies, and that makes it hard to compare to a larger scale just based on the sheer size of them. The particle sizes vary a little bit. The concentration of the peroxide was anywhere from 2 to 30%, which is quite a big change between some of the studies. The ratio of peroxide to the coal was anywhere from 1 to 40 times. Typically it was up to 5 to 10, but some of them used significantly more. And the more peroxide you add, generally the more you're going to break the coal down. But many didn't go to completion, so that makes it very hard to compare. The dilution, so the amount of solid to the liquid, there was a lot more liquid being used, which makes it hard to compare, and also something that wouldn't scale well. The temperatures range from 20 to 80 degrees, which is a very big range, particularly making it difficult to compare. and the time was anywhere from quarter of an hour to 24 hours for most of the studies. The few that were done at the room temperature, 20 degrees, were for, I think, 10, 20 and up to 200, just over 200 days. So there's quite a variation in the duration. And the target analysis of compounds are a bit different. So some were looking at humic acids, some were looking at fulvic acids, and others were looking at much smaller carboxylic acids. So very specific groups or particular compounds that they were trying to produce. One of the key requirements of a PhD is finding the research gap, what hasn't been done already. And one of the things that's missing is a particular research relevance to this kind of research. So many studies have been done, but they're often not done in a way that lends to being able to scale up for an industry. And being an industry-focused project, that's pretty important. So some of the things that are lacking is they use very small masses and volumes for the reactions. They're great in the lab. They're fine for doing an initial trial or comparing a few different reaction conditions. They're not very good for trying to predict what will happen at 1,000 or 10,000 litres. They use very dilute loadings of the coal. So if you were to scale that up to even a 100,000 litre tank, you're not going to get a lot of product out of it. It might be a couple of tonnes of dry product. We want to make it as economical as possible, which means having it fairly dense as we can practically get it. Many have used an excess of peroxide, but then limited the time. Now, peroxide costs money, and dealing with the unreacted peroxide is potentially a big issue. So if we can use just the amount we need, or maybe a little bit more, and then find a way to stop the reaction, that would be much more ideal. And there's been a big lack of reporting complete data, so it's been very hard to try and compare the studies because many don't report the results on the same basis. They have their own little way of reporting the yields, and they often don't refer back to the original dry basis coal, so you can't do a direct percentage comparison between studies, which makes it rather challenging. So the contribution that this project is aiming to make is taking a much more holistic approach than what's been done in the literature so far, and trying to measure each fraction. So many haven't considered the humin fraction. They may not have even considered the humic acid fraction, and maybe only the soluble part under acidic conditions. And so really trying to quantify each of those and look at the chemical changes in each one to better understand how the reaction's actually happening so that we can optimize it. The other part is getting industry relevant data and lending itself to developing a process that'll scale. So that includes having more concentrated slurry, so a lot of solid, or a lot more solid for the amount of liquid in there. More total lignite mass, because we want to be able to make a good amount of product in each batch. And yeah, the total reaction volume will obviously matter with that as well. So most have been done in less than 500 mils and less than 60 grams of coal. So we'll be aiming for more. So there's some key aims we've got for the project. And the first one is looking at a systematic approach to the oxidation process, which includes using a factorial design. So looking at each of the key variables in each combination and then how that affects the outcome. So looking at things like the temperature, the amount of peroxide we add, and the starting pH as things that we can control. And in doing that, we're going to use a whole system approach, so looking at the mass balance to start with, and then where the mass is going. So looking at each of the fractions, the insoluble, the humic acid, the fulvic acid, and then accounting for any losses we might have from the system. And that'll really help with understanding the relationships between the variables we're using and what the outcome of the reaction is. So not just the yields, but also the properties of each of those fractions. So are we adding more oxygen to the humic acid, for instance? We'll also be looking at developing monitoring tools. So one thing that hasn't been done particularly well is figuring out how to track a reaction that's going on. So this will help with assessing the progress of a reaction, which could look at measuring the amount of peroxide and or also looking at changes in the products. So certain things might become more abundant as the reaction goes further along. We'll also be looking at assessing the humic and fulvic acids that are formed and comparing those to commercial products to know if we're getting close to what's already available. There's also a big focus on practicability. So it's really trying to get a robust method that'll work under a range of different conditions. It's one thing to get it working in the lab. It's another thing to have it so that it can work in a less ideal setup and when you start scaling it. And there's also the considerations for occupational health, safety, and the environment. So looking at how safe the chemicals are to work with and whether it produces any particular wastes that are going to be hazardous. And part of that also is the cost. So to make it practical, it also has to be cost effective. So the key concept is to oxidize the lignite, which should do two things. One is increase the amount of oxygen in the structure. The other one is break down the structure into smaller molecules. So if we start with that and the fairly insoluble material, with increasing amounts of oxidation, we should start to see more humic acid being formed. And then as you continue to get stronger and stronger with the oxidation, more fulvic acid, and that'll start to be favored as the end product. Then we'll start to get small carboxylic acids. And as we get down to the very small ones, they're really not particularly desirable for agricultural purposes necessarily. And if we go way too far, we're just going to end up with carbon dioxide and water, which is definitely too broken down for what we want. Inevitably, we'll make some of these smaller compounds in order to make the ones that we're after. But we want to minimize producing carbon dioxide and water and some of the smaller organic acids that aren't as useful for what we want. And we want to favor the humic and fulvic acid production. Now, whether we target specifically humic acid or fulvic acid might depend on what product we're trying to make. But if we can target mostly that region by getting the right amount of oxygen increased and the right amount of breakdown of the structure of the coal, that should allow us to optimize the end product. So the reaction setup is using a lab reactor that was purchased with grant money from ACI, and that's the ICAR LR1000 reactor, which allows you to heat and stir and monitor pH of an ongoing reaction. Now, some of the variables that we're looking at is the amount of oxidant to coal ratio, so how much peroxide are we adding to the coal, the temperature that the reaction's occurring at, the pH. So far I've looked at acidic conditions, but it's unfortunately been a bit too acidic for the reactor itself. So next I'm looking at more neutral or at least somewhat higher pHs so that it's less corrosive to the metal. Time and speed could be a factor. So if you look at the same amount of oxidation, but you run the reaction more quickly, it doesn't make a difference. Modifiers, so potentially minerals that you add in there that might help catalyze, or even the use of a surfactant to help break apart the insoluble structure in the slurry so that it's more soluble and able to get access to the water and the peroxide more easily. So increase the surface area. Changing the atmosphere in there, so normally it's just air that is in contact with the coal slurry inside the reactor vessel, but if that was purged with nitrogen, so you just run a small flow of nitrogen over it, that might change the outcome. And also looking at the sample preparation. So typically we're using taking the coal as it is in its wet state at about 60% moisture and adding that directly and just checking that the moisture's about the right amount so that we know how much dry coal we have equivalent. But could also look at whether to dry it and having different particle sizes, if that makes a difference to the reaction rate or the outcome. Some of the key changes I've observed with the oxidation in the lab is that we get a lightening of the solids. So the solids get more red-brown from the closer to black colour that they start as from the original coal. As we oxidize it more, it lightens up in colour. In contrast to the liquid phase, where it gets a lot more actually dissolved matter in there and possibly bigger molecules over time being dissolved, it gets noticeably darker, like very, very dark. It's actually quite opaque by the more extreme reactions. So one of the key changes we've seen in the properties of the humic acids is there's been an increase in the amount of carboxylic acid groups in the structure and a reduction in the amount of aromatic groups. And that makes sense with increasing the amount of oxygen and breaking the structure apart. So the key overall data shows that we've got, for each reaction where we've added peroxide, compared with the control, blank, there is an increase in the amount of humic acid, which makes sense. If we oxidize the coal, we get more humic acid than what there was to start with. There is, however, the maximum for this data around the 1-to-1 ratio, so equal amounts of peroxide to the coal. It's not clear exactly where the true maximum would be, so more reactions will have to take place in order to figure that out. It could be before the 1-to-1 in terms of ratio. It could be between that, the 1-to-1 and 2-to-1, but that'll take some more investigation. Now, the key trends that interrelate are that we've got a reduction in solids recovery with further oxidation, and that suggests that some of the coal is being broken down into carbon dioxide and water, which makes sense that that would happen at higher amounts of oxidation. Now, the total organic carbon, which is basically the dissolved carbon-based or organic materials that are in the acidic solution at the end of the reaction, has increased quite markedly. So it starts pretty slowly and it starts rising a lot quicker towards the end. But that coincides quite well with the pH dropping off and leveling off. Now, the coal's quite acidic to start with at a pH of between 3 and 3.5. That's actually quite an acidic coal. And in the most extreme reaction, that's lowered to about 1.15 for the pH, which is very acidic and suggests there's a lot of small organic acids being formed. So some of the future experimental work is going to be looking at really systematically testing these different parameters and how that affects the yield and the chemical properties of the products. So I've been looking at temperature and the oxidant to coal ratio, but those will be looked at in more detail and in more combinations, and particularly also incorporating pH, as that will be an important one as well. Exploring things as to whether they make a difference, but maybe not in the full factorial design. So looking at sample preparation, whether wet versus dry makes a difference, the particle size, the reaction speed. So if you did the same amount of oxidation, but you did it quickly versus slowly, would that matter? Does purging the air that's in the reactor and changing it with nitrogen reduce the amount of oxidation you get? It might well do. And then any modifiers, so something like a surfactant or urea that helps break apart the coal structure, might help with increasing the rate of oxidation. And then from this, hopefully we'll find the ideal conditions for producing agricultural humic and fulvic acid from lignite. So the idea is to start broad and try a range of different variables in different combinations, and then hone in and really tease out the region that's of interest and get a lot more detail and data in that particular area so that we can really optimize the production process. This is the overall budget. There's already the major purchase of the lab reactor, which was the primary plant equipment for the project. There's been a number of materials bought, so reagents, glassware, spare parts, and there's still some allocated left for future expenses for the reagents for all the reactions. There's also an allocation for travel and conference attendance. This is the timeline from February this year, so it's been impacted by COVID a bit, but this is the basic plan as it still stands. Is the three main areas to be working on for future work. So that's the developing the monitoring tools to track what's going on in the reaction, to test the oxidation conditions and how they impact on the outcome of the reactions, and then also to compare the products that we're producing with existing reference samples. The industry placement with Omnia has begun, but will start to occur more often into the future. Later on, there'll be the optimization and costing to try and round out the project and the placement. And with the three areas being worked on, there's paper writing incorporated in those, and that will culminate in writing up the thesis for the PhD. So just wrapping up, I've covered a little bit about why humic substances are important. They play a pretty critical role in soil health and maintaining food and fibre productivity for agriculture. There's been a growing commercial demand for humates, and therefore it's really critical that there's an efficient production process that is sustainable into the future. Now, oxidations, we've already shown, has been an effective way of increasing the amount of humic acid from run-of-mine lignite. But more work's needed to better understand how each of those parameters really affects the outcome, the products that are formed and their particular properties. Because then if we really understand how that process works, it'll be much easier to optimize for an end target. And whether that's agricultural, so things like humic or fulvic acid, or whether it's for feedstock into another process, so it could be advanced carbon materials, whether it's something for producing graphene oxide, or whether it's for production of something like quantum nanodots. I'd like to acknowledge the key parties involved in the project. So we've got Federation University, who are supporting me through an RTP fee offset scholarship, as well as my supervisors for helping guide me through the project. We've got Omnia Specialties, who are the industry partner, and they're providing industry experience. So I get the industry placement as part of the project, and also their knowledge and guidance in the production of humates. And there's also Australian Carbon Innovation, who are pretty pivotal in the project, who have funding through ANLEC R&D and the state government. And so they've helped provide key plant equipment and also the stipend for myself.